Good morning, everybody. I'm happy myself and Dr. Nazan to be here today. Like Professor said, this is an interaction, so feel free to give your comments, ask questions, and we're here to learn from each other. My presentation is going to talk about strategies to prevent sexual violence in conflict. Now, we don't have all the answers. What I will present today are some possible interventions that can be looked at to address sexual violence in conflict. And my presentation is going to focus on, one, we will look at the international policy framework on sexual violence in conflict. Now, from the onset, I wish to clarify that sexual violence in conflict should not be used synonymously with gender-based violence. When we talk about sexual violence in conflict, we are talking about violations of a sexual nature which are targeted against women, girls, boys, and men by terrorist groups like ISIL, by security institutions, by militia groups, and other armed groups, state and non-state actors. So sexual violence in conflict is not defined to address sexual violence committed by civilians against civilians, but it is sexual violence committed against civilians by armed groups, terrorist groups, and other armed groups. Secondly, I will give some proposals on how to address sexual violence in conflict. Some of these proposals have been used in other contexts. They have worked. Others are yet to be tested, so they are theories. Now, every context is different. What has worked, for example, in the DR Congo may not work in the context of Iraq. So every context has to be looked at closely and localized interventions identified. Thirdly, I will give some examples of ongoing initiatives that are being currently conducted by different actors in Iraq, by the government, by civil society, and by the United Nations. And then I will mention some upcoming initiatives which are linked to addressing sexual violence. For example, empowerment of women to address terrorism and violent extremism, which in the context of Iraq, we know that sexual violence is being conducted as an ideological strategy by ISIL in the context of terrorism and extremism. And then lastly, I will throw in some points for deliberation. The subject of sexual violence is very complex. We don't have all the easy answers. We don't have all the answers, and I don't think we'll ever come up with all the answers. Sexual violence in the context of extremism is very, very new. Research has not been done in this area. It's still something that is being worked on. So we need to think about how do we move forward. Now, if I'm too fast, let me know and I will slow down. Now, the first time sexual violence in conflict was mentioned was by the Security Council when it issued Resolution 1820. And that was the first time the Security Council examined the issue of sexual violence in various forms. For example, forced rape, forced pregnancy, abductions. And this examination came about because of the changing of the dynamics of conflict. Over the last years, we've seen conflicts have changed, not from state against state conflicts to intrastate conflicts, particularly affecting civilians. And this prompted the Security Council to examine and define sexual violence. And that was the time they issued Resolution 1820, which recognizes sexual violence as a tactic of warfare. We have seen conflicts, for example, in Eastern Congo, in Liberia, in Sierra Leone, where sexual violence has been used as a warfare to attack civilians, particularly women and girls. And Resolution 1820 defined sexual violence in conflict as a matter of international peace and security. And it is a matter of regional peace and security, looking at the context of the Middle East. Then came another resolution, Resolution 1888, which again was issued by the Security Council. And this one goes much deeper. It builds on 1820. Basically, Resolution 1888 defines infrastructure on how to prevent and respond to sexual violence in conflict. First, it talks about the need to have a high-level leadership. And out of this resolution, the Secretary General appointed the first special representative for sexual violence in conflict, Margaret Wallström, who is now currently the Foreign Affairs Minister for Sweden. After Margaret Wallström, we do have now Zainab Hawa Bengura, who recently visited Iraq and the Middle East as part of a fact-finding mission to understand the scope of sexual violence committed by ISIL. Resolution 1888 also talks about building judicial response to bring perpetrators of sexual violence in conflict to justice. It has been very, very challenging to bring perpetrators to justice. What Resolution 1888 talks about is placing command responsibility, for example, the heads of militia groups and armed groups, to be responsible for violations committed under their command. We have had a few trials under the International Criminal Court where heads of militia groups have been tried for sexual violence in conflict, but it is happening. 1888 also talks about strengthening service response. How do we provide effective psychosocial support to survivors of sexual violence, to families of survivors of sexual violence, and how do we provide that response in a way that it does not worsen the conditions of the survivors, in a way that it does not compromise the integrity and confidentiality of survivors of sexual violence. And then 1888 also talks about building a reporting mechanism. Now, it has been very difficult to sometimes detect and report cases of sexual violence in conflict because of the stigmatization associated with that, also because of issues of safety and security. And we are seeing that in Iraq, where we have some survivors of sexual violence who have come back from ISIL captivity. Not many of them are willing to go forward and report because of safety and security. How do we guarantee the protection? So 1888 also talks about the need to create a mechanism for reporting. This mechanism is called the MERI, Monitoring, Analysis, and Reporting Arrangements. Now, within the context of Iraq, we have not yet set up the MERI system. However, we are currently working with the government, civil society, and UN agencies to build a good reporting system based on the GBV integrated management reporting system. 1888 also talks about identifying early warning indicators that would be able to detect possible sexual violence violations, indicators that will be able to inform of impending and ongoing sexual violence. And the purpose of these indicators is to inform analysis and to help stakeholders to be prepared to prevent attacks where possible and to be able to respond effectively where these attacks happen. After 1888, the Security Council issued another resolution on 1960 in 2010. 1960 talks about the accountability architecture. Specifically, it calls for information on parties credibly suspected of committing or being responsible for sexual violence to be listed and to be reported to the Security Council for possible sanctions. Currently, the SRSG for sexual violence in conflict, Zainab Bengura, is working very closely with the Sanctions Committee to include perpetrators of sexual violence like Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi to be on the list of perpetrators. And then we have Resolution 2106. This is the most recent resolution that was issued by the Security Council in 2013. It explains how to operationalize sexual violence prevention and response, and how to ensure these efforts are integrated throughout the peace and security agenda. There is need to integrate sexual violence as a political item on the global agenda. And in the context of Iraq and Syria and the region, it's very, very critical. Some of the things that it talks about is including women in mediation efforts, including women's participation in security sector reform, and I'm happy that MERI has been involved in training the police in this area. It's very critical. It also talks about women's participation in justice sector reforms. 2106 also talks about including acts related to sexual violence in ceasefire monitoring and agreements. One of the areas that the Department of Political Affairs has done is to come up with a guidance note for mediators in conflict resolutions to ensure that sexual violence is included in the negotiation and peace agreement. Now, in the context of Iraq, it is very difficult you cannot negotiate with ISIL. How do you negotiate with ISIL and tell ISIL that you need to stop doing what you're doing? The inclusion of sexual violence in ceasefire monitoring has been successful in contexts like Democratic Republic of Congo, where it has been possible to engage in discussions with parties to the conflict. For example, militia groups that are interested in getting power in the government. But in the context of Iraq, we need to think of how to address this issue. Is it possible or is it not possible? I hope we can discuss it further. 2106 also talks about strengthening of health systems. How do we ensure that survivors of sexual violence get immediate assistance when a violation occurs? How do you ensure that survivors of sexual violence get, for example, post-exposure prophylaxis kits to prevent infections? And then lastly, 2106 also talks about the role of civil society in providing assistance, particularly in areas where the government is not able to get into. Civil society have a key role. And in the context of Iraq, we have been able to rely on information provided by civil society. Civil society have been able to be fast responders in terms of providing information and assistance to survivors of sexual violence, where the government has not been able to get into those areas. So this underscores the need to work in collaboration, government, civil society, and other actors. Now, what are some of the strategies that can be used to prevent sexual violence in conflict? Now, these are proposals. Like I said earlier, some of them have worked, some of them are still being tested, some of them are yet to be tested. But generally, one of the things that can be done to prevent sexual violence is to put forward advocacy efforts to change norms. A lot of sexual violence happens in a patriarchal society where there's power imbalance between men and women. And many, many times in many cultures, survivors of sexual violence are stigmatized. And there's need for us to advocate and change and remove the shame that is attached to survivors, to put this shame to bear on the perpetrators who are committing the violations of sexual violence in conflict. Another strategy that can be used is to creating safer spaces. For example, improving physical infrastructure, improving patrolling, community policing, ensuring that the physical environment where survivors and civilians are, they're much safer, improving lighting, for example, around IDP camps, around refugee camps, or around areas where populations could be much more vulnerable to sexual violence in conflict. Another strategy is improving of reporting and investigating. Information is very, very critical. Information will help us understand the patterns, the trends. Information will help us identify where the gaps are. So information is very, very key to understand the changing dynamics and come up with informed and evidence-based policy decisions that can help us come up with prevention strategies. The other area is justice and accountability. And in this area, we need to think about, for example, advocating for states to ratify the Rome Statutes of the International Criminal Court. It also calls for us to encourage states to improve their legal system, where, for example, sexual violence should not be a crime that is subject to amnesty provisions. Bringing perpetrators to accountability helps deterrent, and it brings faith in the judge. Is how do we ensure that sexual violence will not be used as a tactic for revenge in areas that have been retaken from ISIL control, in communities where there's tensions? How do we ensure that sexual violence will not be used as a tactic of revenge? We need to step in and start doing awareness creation, prevention before sexual violence occurs. Another area is funding. There is need for us to put in funding for research. The use of sexual violence in the context of extremism and terrorism is very, very new. And every context is different. We need to put in funding for research to better understand how some of these groups, for example, like ISIL, are functioning. How do we raise funding for further research? Another strategy is providing more practical support that is based on specific context. No one size fits all. We need to look at every context, understand the context, understand the root causes, the drivers of sexual violence in that context, and come up with localized solutions. We also need to keep sexual violence as an issue on the global political agenda, and I think a lot of efforts are being done in this particular area. In September 2013, at the sidelines of the General Assembly Heads of State and Government meeting, foreign affairs ministers came together and endorsed what they call Declaration of Commitment to End Sexual Violence in Conflict. Iraq has signed this declaration. It is very comprehensive. It is a very strong political tool that can be used to advocate for funding, to advocate for much more political commitment to address sexual violence in conflict. The declaration talks about, for example, amending laws to be able to address the long-term consequences of sexual violence. For example, children born out of rape by ISIL. What happens to these children? There's need for us to look at the legal system and ensure that these children are going to be registered. They will not be ostracized. The declaration also talks about having a gender perspective in policing, in security reforms, in justice reforms. So it is a very, very strong tool that can be used in our context in Iraq. Another initiative that has been done is that in June 2014, the UK government hosted a global summit to end sexual violence in conflict. And this summit was attended by over 100 states, civil society groups, UN agencies, and politicians. One of the outcomes of this summit was the launching of a protocol on the documentation and investigation of sexual violence. This protocol has been introduced to the context of Iraq by the UK government. It is quite comprehensive, and it provides guidance on how to document and investigate sexual violence in conflict. And then recently, the UN General Assembly passed a resolution declaring 19th June as the International Day to End Sexual Violence in Conflict. Currently, there are efforts in Iraq that have been proposed to declare 15th of August as the National Day to End Sexual Violence in Conflict. Another strategy that we have to focus on is the inclusion of women in counterterrorism efforts and efforts to address radicalization and violent extremism. As we know, in the context of Iraq, the sexual violence that is being perpetrated in the context of terrorism, and there is need to include women in counterterrorism efforts. In September last year, the Security Council issued a resolution 2178, which for the first time calls upon the empowerment of women, the youth, leaders, religious leaders, political leaders, to empower them to address radicalization. Radicalization is a war that has to do with the mindset, and we need the efforts of everybody. It is not going to be won with just military means. We need to use soft tools, engaging in communities that feel disenfranchised, engaging in young people, giving employment to young people, and discouraging intolerance and encouraging inclusion. Currently, there are initiatives that have been addressed. We have the National Action Plan on 1325, which was launched by the government under Maliki. Iraq is the first country in the Middle East to launch such a plan. The current action plan is based around 4 pillars: protection of women's rights, prevention of violence against women, participation of women in political processes, and also the need to have women engaged in early recovery, reconstruction, and stabilization. Now, the challenge we have is there's no funding yet that has been allocated to implement this plan. We also have the call for action, which was launched by the Women's High Council, which also addresses the issue of prevention and response to sexual violence in conflict. Another initiative is the visit of SRSG Zena Bangura. This visit was the first high-level visit to Iraq and the Middle East, and it has opened the door for further engagement with Iraqi political leaders on how to address sexual violence in conflict. The visit has also put the issue of sexual violence in Iraq at the global map. There's a lot of discussion now internationally and regionally on how to support the efforts to address sexual violence in conflict. Another initiative that is coming up is the International Conference on Countering Violent Extremism. It's going to happen in September 2015 at the sidelines of the 70th UN General Assembly Heads of State and Heads of Government meeting. And these opportunities, again, to lobby and to appeal to the international community to put in more funding, more commitment to address sexual violence. In October, we do have the 15th anniversary of 1325. There's going to be an open debate with the Security Council. For the first time, the Council is going to debate with civil society groups, women leaders, on the issue of terrorism and extremism as a new threat to women, peace, and security. And we do hope that out of that debate, there will be some concrete actions that will move the efforts ahead. And then lastly, we do have the draft resolution, which has been submitted by the government of Iraq. It is a resolution that the government of Iraq intends to pass to the third committee of the General Assembly. And this resolution is basically addressing the protection of women and girls from minorities, communities, from violent extremism and terrorism. We hope that this resolution will be supported and it will be voted and eventually passed. Now, what are some of the points to note in terms of how we approach the discussion on sexual violence in conflict? Like I said, it's very complex. We don't have all the answers, and we may never have all the answers. Now, one of the things that we need to understand is, in the context of Iraq, the conflict is ongoing with ISIL, and the conflict is regional. So we need to also have a regional approach, rather than only a specific Iraq approach. Secondly, ISIL is one party that we cannot negotiate with. The Security Council resolutions I've mentioned call upon the government to engage with parties to the conflict and enter into agreement. We cannot negotiate with ISIL. What can we do? What can we do then in this situation? Thirdly, we need to strengthen the infrastructure for addressing sexual violence in conflict, including the long-term consequences of sexual violence in conflict. Do we have all the tools to do that? And how can we help as the international community? How can we collaborate together? Another concern is safety and security. This remains one of the biggest challenges, particularly when it comes to survivors of sexual violence. Like I said, many of them are reluctant to report. because of safety and security concerns. How do we address this? Can we guarantee the security? How do we enhance reporting to ensure that there's confidentiality? We need to focus on efforts to ensure that sexual violence will not be used as a tool for revenge, particularly in areas that have been retaken from ISIL control. Funding for operations and research is lacking. How do we source for funding, or how do we collaborate with academic institutions, research institutions, and try to expand the ongoing research initiatives to include sexual violence in conflict? Another point to note is there are opportunities to address human rights issues and work towards transforming gender dynamics. How do we utilize those opportunities? And then the last point is there is need for sustained engagement and commitment. We cannot win the war on sexual violence in conflict without sustained commitment and engagement with everybody concerned. Thank you very much. That is my presentation. We will leave for the questions later. So I will invite Dr. Nazan to give her presentation. And then after that, we will open the floor for discussion. So keep your questions and comments.
To talk about gender and violence in the context of globalization and focusing on Iraqi Kurdistan region. I talked to Professor Dilawar Al-Adin and said I would rather narrow it down and bring it to honor-based violence as an integral part of gendered violence. By way of introduction, I'm going to go through several definitions, the definition of globalization, the definition of honor and honor-based violence, and also I will be talking about other concepts. Globalization, as we all know, is a complex and multifaceted concept, and it affects different people, different groups in different ways. When I was researching this subject, I've realized that there is very little literature available on gender and violence in the context of globalization in relation to the Middle East, let alone in relation to Kurdistan. My paper focuses on certain aspects of globalization, mainly economic and cultural globalization, as well as communication regarding gender relations in Iraqi Kurdistan region. And within that perspective, I will be looking at two related notions. One notion which is very dear to Dr. Dilawar is good governance and honor and masculinity. I am trying here to answer some questions, mainly how do women drawn into and participate in liberalized global mode of production in Iraqi Kurdistan region, and how do that process affected women's lives? Trying to look at experiences and counter consequences, empowering and disempowering aspects of globalization, and also try to answer the question about how do women negotiate their encounters with globalized structures and communication. That means, I'm going to look at their strategies, their action to resist inequality and violence, notably honor-based violence. Globalization, as I said, is a complex concept, stimulated competing definitions. My definition here is a combination of three main theories in the area of globalization, notably Cooper and Robertson, and also Hala Afshar, who is the only academics who wrote about gender and violence in the Middle East and in the context of globalization. So the combination of the definition is that globalization implies a process of global, borderless interaction, interdependence, and connectedness with free movement of capital, business, ideas, views, services, and world communication. The WWW, World Wide Web, is the best imagery of globalization. Now, while I was doing my research on honor-based violence in Iraqi Kurdistan, which is addressed here in my book that I co-authored with my colleagues at the University of Bristol and Roehampton, one of the questions that I used to ask my participants in the research is their definition of honor. What is honor? Many people used just to ignore the question. Some people got shocked, but the general definition that I gathered is categorized here. The first reply to that is that honor is virtue, honesty, truthfulness, and loyalty to homeland. دلسوزی با گلونیش تو من. And immediately after that, they say, oh, it's women's conduct and social representation in the collective imagination. Narrowed down further, it's about honor is women's body and sexuality, and men's capacity and force to exercise control over their womenfolk. Here, in this context, women are surrounded by multiple social and sexual boundaries. If they breach these boundaries, they bring shame and disrespect to themselves, to their family, to their tribe and community. The acts mainly consist of forming overt love relationship, losing virginity before marriage, and having sex outside marriage. Honor-based violence, in that context, is a multiple forms of intimate violence committed mainly against women by male family members and relatives. It's perpetuated within patriarchal norms and traditions with strict code of silence, and generally it involves a premeditated act aimed at restoring lost or threatened honor and reputation as constructed by the family and wider community. Usually, honor-based violence is differentiated from other forms of domestic or gendered violence on the basis that it occurs within the framework of collective family and community structures. Internationally, for a long time, honor-based violence has been considered a private issue, a cultural matter, and it was not considered a violation of human rights by any government, any governments in the West, and also by international organizations, including the United Nations. In that context, culture and cultural relativity have been used as a mitigating factor to reduce sentence. And in the West, because it's been considered a private and cultural matter, it has led to stigmatizing ethnic and religious community groups, including the Kurds. To contextualize the location that I'm dealing with, we know that Kurdish women in all parts of Kurdistan are repressed and isolated, both in terms of their immediate private location, but also by historical conditions as minorities in different countries. And in Iraqi Kurdistan, since the first Gulf War, and more particularly since the fall of Saddam Hussein, exposure to globalized mode of production led to many socio-economic and political changes. The process intensified economic globalization and enabled women to participate in paid labor and engage in social and political activities more actively. And the connection to global network has been relieving but led to contradictory consequences. Women have been brought to work in the context of globalization. They have been brought to work outside the private space, and they have been more visible in public spaces. They've been engaged into the globalized mode of production and paid labor. They've been engaged into new forms of mobilization, action, and resistance. However, women have been subjected to discrimination and marginalization in addition to continuing domestic responsibility. Kurdish women experience another aspect of global economy through international organizations and agencies. International agencies provided funds to women's rights groups here in Iraqi Kurdistan and interacted in conducting joint activities. The provision of international funds changed the nature of women's organizations in two ways. Firstly, that led to a relative, I say relative kind of, independence from political parties, because we know that traditionally all women's rights groups were born inside political parties, and in that sense the agenda of political parties formed the agenda of women's rights groups. But to be able to receive funds from other structures, other organizations than their political parties, that led them to be more or less independent. But the funds from international organizations and also interaction in conducting joint work turned them from small democratic, between quotation marks, units into larger organizations with new hierarchies and competition. They are often and through global communication, trans and cross-country connection, Kurdish women have been exposed to culture and values beyond their immediate location that raise awareness about another dimension of freedom, gender equality, human rights, and women's rights. Women started to look differently at specificities of their culture, and they put their culture into question, criticizing the notion of honor as embodied in women's body and sexuality. The contradictory consequences resulted as the outcome of that. Women have been hired on cheap labor. They've been highly underpaid. The global context subjected them to harassment, which was intensified with the absence of protection mechanisms at their workplace. There have been little space left for mentality transformation. Men resisted the change, and they resisted to integrate new global mode of production and change. There has been no structural change to accompany this process. That means, for example, there hasn't been child support mechanisms, no creche, and that led women to depend highly on their families. And as the consequences, that led to reinforcement of kinship and patriarchal control and norms. The whole process hindered women's liberalization and self-protection, and intensified. That was intensified, of course, by colliding two different mindsets, traditional and modernizing forces. Honor as an intrinsic part of culture has become the core of public feminist debate here in Kurdistan, but also inside the Kurdish diaspora abroad. Men's involvement in such a discourse has been limited. You have so many intellectuals, male intellectuals, but they haven't really integrated women's freedoms and women's gender equality into their work and their discourse. With little change in the general mentality, but mainly male mentality, Kurdish women landed with burdens of underpaid work and political activism. They have been challenged to cope with moral and family duties, traditional mindset, as well as employment imperatives within their male-dominated workspace. And many women activists have paid a high price for their struggle, including they have been facing new forms of violence through the internet that I call it cyber violence. Good governance. Of course, globalization has raised the debate around good governance in Iraqi Kurdistan region. And what's good governance? Good governance requires that governments uproot corruption, adhere to democratic principles, and respect human rights, gender equality, social justice, etc. And the Kurdistan Regional Government has been commanded to set up strategies to address human rights violations, gender inequality, and the lack of freedom of speech, etc. And violence against women and honor-based violence have been at the heart of this problematic. Have women integrated new forms of mobilization strategies to resist and face gender discrimination and honor-based violence? Women have been faced with the reality of violence, and they have chosen to look to the world and use its standards to advocate their rights, speak out against violence, and formulate their demands for change. At the same time, while this is going on, there have been some high-profile honor killing cases in inside Kurdish diaspora in Western countries, including in Sweden and in the UK, to mention just two, Heshu Yunus and Fatima Shahindal, Heshu in the UK and Fatima in Sweden. They had mobilized European governments to address honor-based violence inside Kurdish communities, and Kurdish women have been involved in that action and mobilization. Kurdish women, mainly inside Kurdish communities in European countries, have been involved both in such debate and strategies for action, and that has led to positive outcome. That means they joined global feminist discourse and putting pressure on authorities both nationally and internationally to set up strategies in order to address honor-based violence, both through legislation but also through praxis and policy. The integration of globalized policies and practice perceived by some sectors of society as aligned and Western lifestyle, meaning modernity, and they've perceived it as something which is imposed on them rather than born from grassroots and developed within, progressively within society. The argument developed in that is that the democratic mode of governance cannot be imposed from outside. That's the discourse that we encounter on a daily basis. It cannot be imposed from outside, often leads to reaction, negative outcome, if conditions for such modes of production, governance, and interaction are not in place. And the mentality has not followed the change. We've said that, and that has led to the breakdown, to disintegration, to conflict and violence, politically and interpersonally. We experience that right now in a very grim reality. And combining this with the nature of Kurdish nation as a fragmented, heterogeneous group, that has been more intensified. The situation in most developing countries, including Kurdistan region, led to emergence of fundamentalism, extreme violent acts. Fundamentalist reactionary sectors rejected modernity, this is how they call it, and rejected the integration of new strategies in action, and they advocated return to the source, whatever that means, traditional or authentic Kurdish culture, عادات وتقاليد كلتوري رسني كردي. They advocate that, mainly Islamic and Islamist groups. Gender relations has been at the heart of the global intersection and counter reactions, because globalization challenged traditional gender relations and established norms and values. Part of the counter reaction is related to the perception of masculinity and socially constructed norms and values, including honor, which are characterized by, of course, male advantage hierarchy with dominant male and subjugated female orders. There has been a strong resistance on the part of men. This is based on field work. There has been a strong resistance. They have difficulties accepting possible reversal of roles and domestic responsibilities. I would love to hear from men who are sitting here later, their comments on that. They seek to keep existing power relations and structures of gender relations. Men feel threatened, adhere to patriarchal methods, and resort to violence in private and public spaces, and honor as an intrinsic part of culture and socially, morally accepted norm has been used to justify gender-based violence and violence in the name of honor. Through the globalized mode of communication, production, and cultural interaction, new forms of resistance emerged, and that has led to cross-country and transnational dialogue and alliances with women's rights groups and NGOs, both at home between different groups, but also between NGOs and women's rights groups in Kurdistan and outside Kurdistan. Women from Kurdish diaspora as well as from inside Kurdistan have been invited to join international debate on honor-based violence and engage into policy and practices. But that has been done with subtle forms of discrimination because often women are marginalized in that discourse and form of resistance. My concluding remarks consist of 3 slides. As I said, Kurdish nation is highly fragmented, and they have experienced an acute and often violent internal division, conflict, and rivalry. Exposure to globalized economy and other forms of global interaction added to further complexity in Iraqi Kurdish society mainly. And Iraqi Kurdish society currently going through many social, economic, and political changes. These attributes have remarkably shaped social and political life in Kurdistan region with a kind of social confusion. We all know and see that on a daily basis. Women and gender relations are at the center of this fragmentation, struggle, and problematic. Kurdish women are integrated into liberalized global mode of production, mobility, and cross-country connection with complex and contradictory impacts, both in the context of their inclusion and exclusion, and contradictory effects of globalization being both empowering and disempowering for women. While global interconnectedness and inclusion facilitated women's engagement into globalized mode of production, paid labor, new forms of discourse, of resistance, awareness-raising programs, these are all empowering attributes. At the same time, that has led to exploitative and reactionary contexts leading to exclusion and violence, such as cheap labor, no protection mechanisms, little space has been left for mentality change, rivalry, and conflict. These have been categorized as disempowering attributes for the society in general, but mainly for women, which is the subject of our seminar here. In the lack of a strong political structure here in Kurdistan, forces within both contexts, disempowering and empowering, collide. Modernity, democratic values have been colliding with traditionalism and fundamentalism in the name of political Islam, maybe. And that has created global related forms of division, disintegration, social confusion, and violence. And honor has been used both to justify such violence, but also as a mitigating factor to avoid sentence and establish justice. My final remarks is that in relation to honor-based violence, reactionary forces seek to redefine the role and duty of women. They impose a form of social control that means controlling their body, their sexuality, their conduct, and they try to preserve traditional values and including honor as embodied in women's body and sexuality. And finally, the only academics who wrote about the subject in the context of general Middle Eastern societies, Hala Afshar, says globalization can be liberating for women, at the same time exploitative and counterproductive. We cannot make simplistic statements here, as globalization is a complex, multifaceted concept, not a unitary causal mechanism. And for those who are interested to know which references I've used, here is a list of biographies. Okay, thank you very much.